My guest today is Bhargavi Zaveri-Shah. She's a lawyer, turned researcher, turned founder. Her legal work has focused on central banks and financial regulation in emerging economies. She has spent years at the Finance Research Group in Mumbai, serves as a research lead at xKDR Forum, and writes a fortnightly column on finance and governance for the print. She is now also the CEO of Litanalytics, where she's building an Indian litigation analytics engine. Bhargavi wrote an incredibly interesting paper recently, arguing that voluntary market transactions, what economists call Coasian bargains, might be a better way to resolve cultural and religious conflicts than asking the state to choose sides. The example from her paper that made me want to talk to her was that a group of Jains could pool money to buy goats from a Muslim market on Eid in order to save them from ritual slaughter, instead of the state deciding whether animal slaughter was good or bad. When I reached out to her to chat about this idea, I discovered one that she held even more deeply: that animals are the kinds of beings worthy of moral consideration in the first place. They are sentient, capable of suffering, and should not be excluded from our moral calculus. I've wanted to discuss animal ethics on this podcast forever, and I'm so thrilled to have Bhargavi on to do this. As always, I hope you enjoy listening to us disagree. Hello, hi Bhargavi, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Deepak. Great to be here.
Um, we have met each other a bunch of times, maybe about two, three times in the past, primarily at the Emergent Ventures conferences
Yeah.
and or Ideas of India as well, I think. And whenever I've met you, I've thought of you as okay, so she's a lawyer and she does serious work when it comes to regulation and emerging economies, these sorts of things. You work with xKDR, so again, fairly serious organization doing really high level stuff. I was very surprised to conclude that the topic that we picked is animal sentience, animal rights, animal suffering. um, just in brief, like how does somebody get here at all? How did you get here at all? How did you end up with something of all the pillars of things I care about? One of the things I truly care about is the fact that animals suffer and that we should include them in our moral calculus.
Right. No, so let me do this in reverse, like a flashback. Okay. So the reason this topic still matters to me, despite being in very, very different areas of life, professionally and vocationally speaking, is because this is dinner table conversation in almost every organization that I've worked in. Now I run an organization of my own, and still, I it's always a puzzle for me that and unfortunately this often happens at lunchtime, and that's why maybe people start avoiding me at lunchtime. But I always bring up the question that, how do you think about the ethics of what we are eating? uh, the people who really care about fair trade, for example, are equally comfortable eating factory farmed food, and I'm just not able to reconcile that about their personality. There is no judgment involved here, but sure, there is a contradiction that stands out. So this is frankly, lunch table conversation every single day in my workplace. And if I really think about it at a deeper level, maybe I am brought. I mean, I'm brought up as a Jain, and Jainism is essentially about nonviolence. I am an atheist, but maybe that social conditioning of the early years stayed with me long enough, such that now I'm not able to just get rid of it. But and then in 2018, I happened to attend a conference on in Germany on how do we marry liberal market principles with environmental concerns. And there, in a couple of sessions, the ideas of animal ethics came up, and
Hmm.
how do we reconcile animal ethics and the state's role in protecting or intervening in our food plates and things like that. So I guess maybe just through serendipity, right? Started with social conditioning as a child, brought up as a Jain, eventually became an atheist, but that didn't matter because somehow, time and again, this subject just I just couldn't avoid it, even in my daily life. And yeah, that's how I end up thinking about it quite a bit. I don't end up reading about it as much because it affects me a lot. It spoils my mood, and it and I guess it affects me at a personal level. But yes, I do end up getting into pretty intense debates on the ethics of eating.
I rarely share personal anecdotes in the podcast because the way that it's supposed to be structured is that I'm simply antagonistic to your point of view, whoever the guest is. But this is also a personal subject for me because I grew up in a household who practiced vegetarianism. Very early on, decided that I was fairly rebellious as a child and decided that I would not play that game. And so would eat meat quite liberally.
Mm.
When I was in the ninth grade, if I'm not wrong, had a friend who made the case for the suffering focused case, right? So this is suffering focused ethics and the problem that animals suffer like we do. And if we give moral consideration to each other, we must extend it to animals. Was convinced by the argument and so changed my mind and became a vegetarian. For a long time was a vegetarian until I flipped back to being a non-vegetarian. And again, it's not about why I've changed my mind or what the points of view there are, but I love the topic because I myself have gone through this 2 or 3 times and I feel conflicted about this as a problem. In fact, I frequently tell my friends that in 200 years, just like we look back at the slave trade era and we say that
Yeah.
that was morally unacceptable,
Hmm.
in 200 years people look back at our times, like the 2026 times, and say that what we do to animals in farms is absolutely unacceptable. It's I mean, how could we have been blind to what happened to animals? So I'm so excited about the fact that I'm even able to do this on the podcast. I want to maybe begin by trying to understand what do we think the first principle argument could be for why animals deserve moral consideration. And broad camps, I think, are you could do single like utilitarian, preference utilitarianism. We're just saying that this is about the suffering of animals. You could also do liberty based arguments that humans have liberty, so animals must have liberty. Then from there, I want to go into things like sentience and consciousness, those sorts of things.
Hmm.
But if you had to just articulate first principles, why you think animals deserve this moral consideration from us, what would that sound like?
Right. So my first principles argument is based in animal sentience. Okay. To me, at least, it seems like a very simple statement, which is that animal sentience deserves moral consideration. Now, for many, moral consideration is in turn justified by utilitarian means. Do they deserve moral consideration because it will make us happier?
Hmm.
Do they deserve moral consideration because the planet will be a better place? For me, moral consideration is an end in itself. So the idea that I must be fair to you in my dealings with you is not so that you can be fair to me in your dealings with me. It's just the way we are wired to be. We are wired. Uh, we as humans have reached a level of consciousness where we factor in morality in all our dealings with each other, and there's no reason why we shouldn't factor in morality when it comes to giving moral consideration to animal sentience. That is my first principles argument, that animal sentience deserves moral consideration. That's it. Yeah.
Got it. And for listeners, just to define sentience, sentience is the capacity for suffering.
Yeah.
So they may not actually be suffering, but they have the capacity for it.
Right. So we can discuss sentience in a little more detail because I think that is where things get very challenging, both for people who want to defend it and for people who want to challenge it, right? So you want to talk about it right now, or should we?
No, no, we can do it. Yeah. So
Okay.
maybe I'll phrase it as a slightly larger question that I've been having. I want to use the word consciousness instead of sentience, which is one level up. I mean, you can tell me if you like a different definition, but I like Sam Harris's definition, which is that consciousness is the sense that the lights are on, that there is a sense of to be. There is some first person to whom experience is happening. Right,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
lights are on,
Hmm.
and I've often troubled some guests on this podcast on why we presume that the lights are on in another human being. And one way to think about this would be so I've heard Richard Dawkins make this case, but it's derived from Sharma, which is uh, which he calls tricks of evolution. So you could say that animal life evolved into human life or sentient life, and this starts with self-replicating molecules
Hmm.
that get more and more complex, and
Hmm.
at some point along the way form single-celled organisms
Hmm.
because they're the best replicators that you have, and those replicators become multi-celled, and then they become whatever different kinds of life forms, and then evolution sort of kicks off.
Hmm.
And somewhere in this journey, what's happened to you and me, I'm sure for me, presumably for you, is that is that we became conscious. That is, there suddenly this qualia emerged, this
Hmm.
sense of like the redness of red, right? The sense
Hmm.
that there is a thing inside me, a man behind my face, to which something is happening. Experience doesn't simply. I'm not a car in the sense that it's not just that when you press the brake, the car slows down. It is that the experience of slowing down is something that I feel, right? Except that evolution could have taken place without this. it is totally possible for evolution to have happened where all you end up with is an extremely mechanical system that does not have a sense of self, that does not have qualia, that is not a being that is processing, and still from the outside looks like it. And in fact, the thought experiment is tomorrow if we're visited by an alien species that lands on Earth and looks like it can suffer, looks like it is intelligent, etc., etc., there is no way for us to conclude that it really feels suffering. It looks like it is suffering, but is there a sense of being in there, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of the levels of. You could
Yeah.
start with sentience. First, you could start with suffering, sentience, then consciousness. How do you structure this?
So, right. So I view this as a spectrum. I view it slightly differently. So, in the journey of evolution, okay, uh, if we look at state of mind as a spectrum, I would begin with intelligence as the most basic. So intelligence is the ability, even computers have intelligence. Today a computer can beat you and me at chess very easily,
Yeah.
right? Intelligence is the ability to form connections, to respond, to take the next step, either as per wired directions or sometimes even a little bit autonomously. The next level, as you come rightward towards on this spectrum, you reach consciousness, which is more autonomy, which is, to borrow from your example, the light is on in this room, I can see it. uh, do I feel happy about it, or is it triggering my migraine? At that point, I go to sentience. Sentience is the highest form of consciousness, in my opinion, because it is consciousness is the ability to have a subjective experience. Uh, sentience is to actually have the subjective experience, right?
Hmm.
Is this light making me feel happy, or is it triggering a migraine? Is it causing me suffering? Is it giving me anxiety? That doesn't, the moment you start feeling that, you are moving towards sentience. So you're always on this spectrum of intelligence, consciousness, and sentience, which is why, I mean, sorry to digress a little bit, but the question that a lot of people ask, will AI become conscious, right? So when will AI get consciousness? We have not yet reached the point where AI will feel sentience. I mean, AI can get consciousness in the way that maybe a lot of autonomous decisions are happening, and we are not able to figure out exactly how that reasoning is happening. But the ability to suffer, the ability to feel fear, the ability to feel joy, excitement, hope, aspiration, all of it is what I put in the sentience bucket. And in these three categories as well, intelligence, consciousness, and sentience, all of it is a mini spectrum in itself. So, what I'm to go back to the original proposition, moral consideration must be given where interests are involved, and that a lot of philosophers have said, right? And now, what is the interest at hand here when we talk about animal food ethics? And I'm saying that actually moral consideration need not be given just because something is intelligent. Moral consideration need not be given just because something is conscious. Moral consideration, I'm putting at the most extreme end of the spectrum, which is sentience. So for me, that's the way I imagine things. And the reason this starts making a difference is because then obviously people keep taking me down the rabbit hole of, oh, but what about eating a cockroach? What about eating a pigeon? What about eating a cow? What about eating a pig? They are on a spectrum, on the spectrum between consciousness and sentience, and we can debate each organism, no problem, as long as you agree with the fundamental proposition here at hand, which is that you must give moral consideration where interests are involved, and the interest in question here is sentience.
Hmm. How do you distinguish between a being that is emulating sentience versus being sentient? If I put Claude in a human-like body,
Mm,
and all the mechanical parts make it look absolutely human,
mm,
such that it were to live in my house, I were to be able to have a conversation with it, um, because it's trained on a large enough data set about how humans behave when sentient, it will emulate sentience. When I
mm,
poke it, it will say "ouch."
mm,
When I tell it a sad story, it will cry,
mm,
and we quote unquote know whatever that word means. We know
mm.
that Claude is emulating sentience as opposed to being sentient. And the charge I'm levying here is perhaps animals are emulating sentience and not being sentient. If that is untrue, if it is that they're actually sentient, how do we prove this?
Right. I'll take you back to Peter Singer here, okay? Because he actually starts off with the exact same questions. How do we know animals are sentient? We are not within them to know that. How do we know that they are capable of having an inner life at all? How do I know whether any human is capable of having an inner life? Okay, all of us are actually, since the since sentient by itself involves a subjective experience, your experience of today's episode is different from my experience of today's episode. The way you experience, what you experience when you see a patient on a ventilator, will be very different from the way I feel when I see a patient on a ventilator. And does that distinction by itself justify treating you and me differently, right? So, for example, um, let's take uh, uh, let's take two humans, one of whom is I would say has less EQ or whatever, is on the autism spectrum, and therefore has other impediments dealing in, with in social interactions, versus a person who's not on the autism spectrum. uh, would you use the same kind of violent language, the same kind of profanity with somebody who's on the autism spectrum, simply because he or she experiences it differently from a person who's not on the autism spectrum? And my argument would be no. We would believe that actually all humans experience violence, experience anger, are experience have the same feeling when they are at the receiving end of anger and things like that. In the same way, we give the benefit of doubt to humans. What makes us think that we shouldn't give the benefit of doubt to species which are actually nearly as evolved, have nearly as evolved central nervous systems as we do, right? I mean, even the idea of evolution, at a very late point of time in evolution did humans truly depart from, the rest of the apes and the rest of the species, right? So why would we think that just because we are slightly differently evolved, we are capable of feeling very, very different things, but actually the animals which have very similar central nervous systems as ours feel it differently, and they are merely emulating it? I don't get it, right?
Yeah,
So even if they feel it at a slightly even if they experience it in a different way, the fact is that they are experiencing the same feeling. A loud noise uh, startles you and me in the same way it might startle a hibernating tortoise, for example. Okay, to a lesser extent, maybe the tortoise reacts differently, but it does startle the tortoise, right? A loud noise startles me less than it startles a dog. Crackers startle me less than firecrackers startle me less than it startles dogs. But you can see the terror. There is no reason for me to believe that a dog that has nearly as evolved a central nervous system as you and I do is merely emulating that expression.
that expression. Yeah, I
Mm.
mean, one may even argue that it is even more startling to animals that are slightly lower down on the evolutionary chain than we are. But in the spirit of disagreeing, two things then that I could ask. First, why not also apply to human beings? In fact, earlier that's what I said, right? I can be sure about my own sense of consciousness. I know that I am, because even if everything is an illusion, if you are not real, if this entire world is made up, even if everything is illusory, the illusion is happening to something. And the thing that is happening to is my consciousness.
Mm.
And so what I can be sure of is that I am conscious. I feel like I'm making an extrapolated bet that you are conscious. Um, but there is no real way for me to prove it. This is not in the realm of scientific things, because a scientific theory has to be falsifiable,
Mm.
and because there's no way for me to falsify that you are not conscious. And
And yet we give moral consideration to every human's interests,
right,
right? So despite me not being able to prove that Deepak feels the same way as I feel when I'm sad, I still give moral consideration to your sadness, and I will try to make sure that you are not sad by my reactions,
yeah,
right? So I think, let's just say, okay, so actually I evaded the Claude question. Okay, where what happens when AI emulates sentience? I don't know. And I we can discuss it, but I don't want to spend time discussing it, because actually the emergent problem at
mm-hmm.
hand, I mean, actually a problem that has been, that we've just been sort of ignoring for, I think, decades now. It's just not got enough attention, or rather it's been talked about in very polarized way, is about respecting animal sentience. So I want to stick to that.
Sure.
At some point, if we have time, happy to just kind of muse about Claude emulating sentience. Okay, so to come back to that point, it is true that I cannot guarantee that just because somebody is tearing up, they truly feel sad. I don't know that. but yet we ascribe moral weight to their sadness, and therefore I'm not we attach a certain presumption. And I think there's no reason why I wouldn't attach it to animals who suffer very, very obvious terror and obviously bad experiences, because I'm not able to falsify the idea that actually they are in fact suffering it.
Hmm.
So
So, sounds to me like a call for consistency. You're saying that by whatever logic you have arrived at the belief that other humans are worthy of your moral consideration, use the very same logic to extrapolate to other organisms like animals, which clearly do suffer in the same way.
yeah.
Yeah, so I understand the call for consistency. That makes sense. Now, then I want to answer that other question. How did I conclude that other humans are worthy of my moral consideration? And for that, at least some camp of believers will argue that they didn't do it through a argument based on suffering. They did it through an argument based on liberty. That is, they said something like, all I'm claiming
Hmm.
is that you are worthy of liberty. You are your own person. You are allowed to freely sign contracts, move from place to place. That you are a sole person. Now you may so choose to do whatever you want with liberty, including inflicting harm and suffering on yourself. You may sign a contract that leads you to a detrimental place. Those are all things that you are allowed to do.
Hmm.
All we are doing is that we're going to erect a societal apparatus that prevents the infringement of your liberty, but
Hmm.
not the maximizing of your subjective well-being, not the reduction of your suffering, but rather just the protection of your liberty. And then maybe where we end up is not a suffering focused framework for
Hmm.
animals, but
Hmm.
rather a liberty focused framework for animals.
um okay, so here's the thing. I It's true that a lot of the philosophers who did speak okay, at least one of the philosophers who did end up speaking about animal suffering was a person who supported liberty out and out. But I'm not sure that moral consideration by itself has emerged only from a liberty oriented framework.
Hmm.
I think, in fact, a lot of the people who talk about morals, okay, so take John Rawls, okay, they come from an interest, like, is somebody's interest being infringed,
Hmm.
right? And if we take that framework, then it goes one level above liberty, which is that actually humans have many interests. Liberty happens to be one of them. Maybe liberty is the one thing that will allow them to perpetuate all their interests. That is also possible. But the point is that you've got to attach moral consideration to perpetuating interests. So, for example, if something else happens in another part of the world, I don't know, a mother lies to a mother lies to a child in another part of the world. In all fairness, I have no I mean, my interests are not harmed by it. I really don't care about it. uh, and nor is my liberty sort of affected by
Yeah.
it. But the point is that you will still ascribe a moral how do you say, a moral standard to that conduct, because there is an interest involved there, and it's got nothing to do with liberty. To be honest, a lot of the things that we ascribe moral standards to has got nothing to do with liberty. I think humans have reached that point in evolution where we are wired to see things in moral terms. And when I say moral, I want to clarify morality to uh, uh, most humans in their day to day life would mean something on the lines of fairness. Okay, actually, fairness is seems to be on the evolutionary path, because even chimpanzees and apes and a lot of behavioral experiments have been done where two chimps who've been treated differently in terms of food giving, etc., behave differently. They understand the idea of fairness. They understand that this portion was not meant for me and I shouldn't be taking away from my
Hmm.
fellow chimps portions and things like that. uh, so I think, since this is of course linked as much to biology and evolution as it is to morals, um, attaching morality to interests is seems like a more I would say an umbrella that houses everybody. What is that umbrella called? Where a big camp, which actually can house all philosophers, because all philosophers, whether they're coming from a liberty perspective or they're coming from a socialist, communist sort of perspective, they what they do attach consideration to is an interest that you want to protect. So Jeremy Bentham, he wrote this at a time when the French had freed the slaves, but the British hadn't. And uh, criticizing that conduct on the part of the British, where slaves were still being treated like animals. This is Jeremy Bentham. He says the French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. It may one day come to be recognized that the number of the legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversible animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose they were otherwise, what would it avail? The question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And like this totally comes from the interest point, right? Like he's not come Jeremy Bentham was at the end of he was the OG utilitarian,
Yeah.
right? He was the OG liberty, a person who propagated liberty through and through his writings. And here, yet, he's coming from the perspective of a wider interest, and that is the interest to prevent suffering, to minimize suffering.
Hmm. Okay. Now, let me try and rephrase my question in the language of interests, if I can. I'm going to try and make the claim that yes, there are many interests that different sentient beings have. The only inviolable interest is that of liberty. Now, the way I'll make this case is for a moment, I'm going to forget about animals and just speak about human beings and say something like there is a person who is presently suffering, and we have a clear path to prevent their suffering. So for example, we could prevent their suffering by they have a gallbladder problem, and we could impose on them an operation that removes their gallbladder problem. They no longer have it, right? So we have a clear path to preventing suffering. But this person says, no, I do not want it. I would much rather wallow in my suffering and much rather suffer than have the operation take place. uh, what we've concluded, and I think rightly so, is that we cannot impose this on them. Once they have said clearly that they do not want this, it does not matter how much they suffer, it does not matter what they add to the total. We will under no circumstance violate their liberty. So far, are you in agreement with me that in the instance that somebody says this suffering is perfectly fine by me, but I don't want to have a solution to the suffering imposed on me, that is my liberty has to be respected, we should stop there and say perfectly fine, then we respect it.
Here, the fundamental difference is that the person who is suffering has agency
Hmm.
to communicate that, right? So, yes, of course, you've got to respect the agency of a person who's suffering. And I'm not so sure how you'll extend that argument to animals. You could say that in the evolution on the evolutionary scale, we've reached a point where we've taken away agency from animals. In that case, how do we protect the liberty of the animal, given that the animal has no way to convey their agency of whether they are being happy, whether they're happy being slaughtered or not, or whether they forget slaughter? Okay, death is, I would say, a much lesser evil than the kind of conditions that you observe in factory farms, etc. But if they had the agency to tell you that we are very happy actually being in factory farms because we are fed on time, we are given enough water, we don't have to escape predators. If they were to tell you that, yeah, it's a hypothetical situation we could have dealt with at that time. And then you'll have to negotiate their rights that, but you must give me this much sunshine during the day. So liberty necessarily assumes agency. Uh, I'm not so sure how you'll extend this argument to animals.
Hmm. Um, I don't know if this is a good line of reasoning, but let me try. I also think about in the instance of children. Take the genital mutilation of children in the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith.
Hmm.
Now, these are children, they cannot consent, but you do have the cutting of the foreskin, you do have the cutting of the clitoris in some parts of the world. And I would argue that this is in some way the eradication of liberty, in that this person is a whole, they own themselves, and we can't do unto a child something that is irreversible in this manner.
Hmm.
And if they choose to do it when they're 18 years old, or
Hmm.
whatever we've drawn as a legal
Hmm.
line, so be it.
Hmm.
But before that, we cannot impose this on them, right? Especially
Hmm.
when they cannot consent.
Hmm.
And maybe even here you may agree that you may say that, look, it makes sense for me to for us to prevent the forcible genital mutilation of children, purely from a liberty standpoint. Because if we take the suffering argument, In this case, what ends up happening is, for somebody of the Jewish faith or the Muslim faith, they will believe that there is a world after this world. There is an infinite afterlife. And the amount of happiness that is to be gained from committing a small amount of pain right now is so large that from a mathematical standpoint, it is inevitable that we must mutilate this child. And you could also do it from a suffering focused standpoint, which is, if we don't do this, and as a consequence, my child ends up in hell, and hell is a pit of burning and suffering forever, then the amount of suffering that I will induce on this child is too high. And so we end up saying, no, no, we're not playing this suffering math game, because everybody has their own, calculus of how this works. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say this child is its own person and not allow for this to take place. So maybe there are some cases where we simply use liberty, even if the child themselves can't consent, to override the suffering argument.
In fact, here I would say that the trade off is between imagined suffering and agency.
Ah, very nice. I like it. Yeah.
Imagined suffering, I don't know, am I under an obligation to mitigate your imagined suffering? I would think not, because that suffering hasn't yet happened, and I cannot even imagine what it will look like when it happens, right? Versus agency, you're giving the child agency that when you are old enough, you decide for yourself what you want to do with your body. So I think it's a very different trade off. Still not able to understand the connection between liberty and animals. Like I keep saying, right? If animals had agency, maybe the liberty framework would have worked. And I'm a total sucker for liberty framework, so I love it. But the reason liberty frameworks don't work is because liberty needs to be exercised. Agency, it necessarily assumes that you have the agency to indicate what you want to do.
If the factories were farming chicken who were lobotomized in a specific way that prevented them from feeling any pain, then is the factory farming of chicken fine?
Okay, so let's define what is suffering. Okay, so one element is what you define, which is the imagined suffering of me, because I'm a religious person and I believe, and I strongly believe that there is an afterlife. The next is real suffering. Some of it is perception, some of it is. Um, so here I'm conflicted, okay? Uh, because instinctively, I would like to say that even chicks which are immune to pain are suffering because they are not living their natural lives. They are living in enclosed spaces, and they are not able to socialize in the way they would have had they been cage-free chickens, or had they been in their natural environment. uh, so that's one part of the argument where you can say that actually it is the interest of every organism to uh, live out its natural environment.
Hmm.
Okay, you could say that. On the other hand, I feel, but if you say that, then how would you justify a lot of uh, pet ownership, right? Exact, something that we touched upon last time. And what is even the natural environment of an organism in a world that's ever changing, right? So I'm conflicted. Okay, so the both side, sorry if I sound like Keynes, but it is, on the one hand, you know the I'm actually depriving the chick of of its natural environment, but on the other hand, what is even a natural environment? uh yeah.
But the I think the use of the lobotomy, just saying that the brain of the chicken is in such a way altered that it cannot feel pain, means it also cannot feel pleasure, for example,
Hmm.
means that it has no desire, preference per se, for a life outdoors. Because what I would think is something like, when a chicken is in its natural environment, or a cow is in the outdoors and grazing in a beautiful field, there is this sense of joy and euphoria and happiness. That is the reward for being in that environment. Except if it cannot feel that anymore, then the preference to be in that environment disappears.
Yeah.
At which point, its preference to be in that environment versus to be in a cage and farmed is no different. And so then, from this ethical framework, we should have no trouble simply breeding in large numbers lobotomized animals.
Yeah, inclined to say yes. If there's no sentience, you're effectively saying that if we are able to produce non-sentient chicks, then surely there is no problem with slaughtering them en masse. uh, I don't know, I'm not following the science on this, but have we made progress on this?
God, no. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
philosophy experiment.
Okay.
But we've
Okay.
made progress on things like growing meat in the lab
Hmm.
without any of the animal around it. So
Hmm.
there's no brain, but there's
Hmm.
only the muscle.
Yeah.
And those things, I'm sure you'd just be like, yeah,
Yeah.
perfectly fine.
Absolutely.
The only reason I brought this up was because when we were thinking about the liberty thing, right? I wanted to make the case that to lobotomize a chicken, to lobotomize a cow, is the infringement of its liberty. And that is the immoral act. The immoral act is to lobotomize a cow. It is not to say that if a cow is lobotomized, then I may do with it as I please. And so it is still liberty that we must pay heed to and not
Yeah, are you
utility.
taking away a certain interest? So yes, it links to the broader point of, are you depriving a chick of the natural environment? Are you depriving a cow of the natural environment? Is it an interest to be protected? So I'll tell you what. The reason I'm conflicted on this is because the world is ever changing. You and I don't live in our natural environment anymore. What is even our natural
Yeah.
environment? So how can I claim that a cow's natural environment is an open-ended pasture land? It may well not have been its natural environment about, I don't know, 250, 300 years ago. So then what? It's hard for me to define the exact interest that I am protecting if I'm not inflicting suffering on it. So,
Okay. Um, one,
if I'm sorry, if
please,
I may
please.
just rephrase that,
Yeah.
it's hard for me to define the exact interest I'm protecting if I'm not inflicting pain on it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
understood. And my case was just that the interest that you are overriding
Mm.
is the interest of liberty, which in this framework that I'm trying to argue from is just the only inviolable interest. There is no other interest that is inviolable. From that, you can come to suffering-based arguments, etc. But you must start with liberty. That's the sort of case that I'm making. That
But the
even
liberty, I mean, yeah. So, okay, but you're saying that the organism is not in a position to feel anything, right? Um, you are depriving it of liberty to do what exactly? Of living in its natural environment, and I'm not able to imagine that natural environment. So
no, but
that's
doing whatever it wants. I'm saying that even before we talk about suffering, we must first grant liberty. That is the first thing to grant before anything else in a moral conversation is brought up. And so, if a dog chooses to run into a hole that on the other side can never come out of and will die by
Mhm,
drowning, we must so allow it to
mhm,
run into the hole because sure it may not know any better, but it is not my job to prevent the dog from doing what it feels it must freely do. Now that may end up causing suffering for the dog,
yeah.
but
You would even then prioritize
liberty
the
of the dog.
dog's
Yes,
wish to run into a hellhole, so to
if
speak.
it's so wants to,
Yeah.
and I think we should talk about, and we will absolutely talk about wild animals
Okay.
and the obligations we have towards wild animals, which includes cases like this. But a small segue into that, the Singer argument,
Mm,
and I've heard it better articulated by Alex O'Connor, so I prefer his example.
mm,
Is he phrased it as a game called Name the Trait,
okay.
and the question is imagine you are in a world 400 years ago, and you have a black man from Africa, and you have a white man who lives, let's say, in a European country or the US, and you ask what is the trait that distinguishes one from the other. Your response may be something like skin color or race, and then we ask the question, why is this a meaningful trait upon which to negate the moral consideration of one while elevating the other? And then at some point we conclude that it's not. It doesn't
Mm,
matter what the skin color is. Both these people should be treated as equal and have equal moral consideration. And then you move to a man and woman, and you say something like, name the trait. What's the
mm,
difference? And you would say gender, sex, whatever. And then on those grounds, you would say, why is that a meaningful grounds to give different moral consideration? You conclude it's not, and so
mm,
you have franchise, etc. And if you follow this train of thought, you arrive at, you have a human being and a pig, and what is the meaningful grounds on which to afford them different moral consideration? And the answer is species.
mm,
And Singer would argue,
mm,
Alex did argue, that then you end up saying that this is not a meaningful grounds on which to offer different moral consideration, and so a pig should be part of our moral calculus.
mm,
I want to hold the frame now that speciesism is a good framework. It is the place to stop. It is where we say that this is where we stop, asking, naming the trait anymore, or this trait is a relevant trait.
mm.
Now I'll try and like defend why that is the case. But how do you feel about this? Do you feel like this line of reasoning, which is you start with, why race, why gender or sex or whatever,
Mm.
and then you end up with then why species, is a reasonable way to argue for that consistency in affording consideration to animals?
So I think speciesism somehow is a parallel argument to the suffering framework. Okay, the suffering framework is irrespective of species. If actually a species is sentient, then there is a moral consideration to attach importance to give its sentience consideration. Um, so for me, it's kind of wired into that framework of suffering, irrespective of species. If there's sentience involved, you got to attach consideration. So for me, speciesism actually is a useful hook to have conversations with people who attach more importance to some kinds of species but not others, and there are a whole lot of them. So just the pet ownership is the classic example. You love your pets, you'll save a stray cat, uh, but at the same time you won't give two hoots about factory farming, right, or about factory farmed food that you're consuming at your next meal. So that is where speciesism becomes relevant, but otherwise I think it's necessarily a part of the broader suffering framework.
Okay. I'm going to try. I mean, I've never done this in public with a few friends in the past.
Hmm.
As far as I've gone with this line of argument,
Hmm.
I've not seen anybody else do it, so I'm going to give it a shot. Is how we choose to use language when we talk about topics like this. The example I tend to give is the use of the word digital camera.
Hmm.
Now, typically, when we use the word camera, what we mean is you point this object at an actual image that you want to capture. The photons of light reflect off the real, like for example, it hits a leaf, it reflects off the leaf. That actual photon is the incident, goes through a lens, reflects off a mirror, is incident on a film, and then that film gets developed into the image, right? And so what you have is a photograph, and what you had is a camera. When digital photography came into the fore, we started using words like digital camera and digital photograph, except it bore no resemblance to the original camera and the original photograph. Like today, when you point a camera at a phone camera at something, what's happening is the photon hits the sensor of a circuitry that then does its own thinking.
Hmm.
It starts to make a guess as to what it thinks it's looking at, and then prints that on on
Okay.
the screen that you see.
Okay.
And so what I'm looking at on my screen when I take a photograph is not those collection of photons. It's the representation of what the sensor, or sorry, that controller, the microcontroller in the
Hmm.
particular phone
Hmm.
thinks it is
Thinks it
looking
is.
at, right?
Hmm.
And this is a very large leap away from an original photograph. These are not very similar things, but because of how we use language as human beings, we're just saying, oh, hook on the word digital, digital camera, digital photograph. It's why, the phone icon on your phone is literally a phone, like an old school phone. It doesn't make any sense, but it's just how we tend to think as human beings. Now, if I take that over to the conversation of consciousness, intelligence, etc., we say things like AI is
Hmm.
artificial intelligence, just like digital camera, but it's nothing like real intelligence. Like when we say intelligence, we just mean human intelligence. That's all we mean. We mean like a meat processing system where you have like meat intelligence, which is a brain, a central nervous system, etc. And that's just nothing like what we're seeing on the AI side. You could come up with a completely new gibberish word for it, and that would be closer than saying artificial intelligence, because these are quite distinct things, right? The process by which you arrive there, etc. And um, th- there's something about our felt experience of what a thing is. For example, the sense of what it is to be is something that is my felt experience. The redness of red is my felt experience.
Hmm.
Now, when I translate it to another human being, I'm already making a little bit of a leap, but a leap that within my species I can somehow understand. I can put myself in that place. I can put myself in the place of, had I been born a woman, it's not too different than my experience of being a man, except in these ways. Had I been born disabled, it's not too experience than my different than my
Hmm.
experience, except in these very small ways. And so there's a leap that's possible. It's a small leap. Versus if I have to think of myself and let's say like a cockroach, or like a worm, the leap that I have to make from this to that is so large that we may so use the word sentience. We may say we are sentient and they are sentient, and so we use the same word. But maybe it's more fair to say something like human sentience and worm sentience, just like human intelligence and artificial intelligence, or digital camera and real camera. And that difference, that distinction is so legitimate that perhaps the math doesn't carry. It's not even apples and oranges. It's probably like not even fruits. Like one of those is a fruit and the other is a vegetable. um, and we're just using, because of how we have language, and we try to put things in categories, we've just
Hmm.
lumped it into the category of consciousness or sentience, but it
Hmm.
doesn't really apply. How do you feel about an argument like this?
Yeah. Okay, so I look at sentience as a, like I keep saying, right? Intelligence is a spectrum. Uh Consciousness is a spectrum. Sentience is a spectrum, and they themselves sit on the spectrum of the broad umbrella called state of mind, right?
Sorry, just to push back.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking of it as a spectrum, could we think of it as completely distinct? That's the argument I'm making. So, for example, that human suffering is its own thing, and worm suffering is its own thing. And we're not on the same spectrum. We're not even in the same universe of things. These are just different universes of things. Like you could sit on a table, but it doesn't make it a chair. We could call a table like a higher chair, but we just give it different categories. Why don't we put these in different categories?
Okay. So there's two ways of responding to this. Okay, one is to carry forward the hypothetical. Okay, and the hypothetical that you would carry forward is actually maybe some kinds of animals. Actually, let's just assume the animal species which are not human, the non-human species, experience pain and suffering differently from humans. Is that a fair proposition to carry forward the hypothetical?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, it's different from the way you and I suffer. Um, then how would we think about inflicting that suffering on non-human species? And here my answer would be that why would we assume, I mean, I'm just not able to wrap my head around this hypothetical. Let's play the counterfactual. Okay, let's say happiness, or let's say reproduction, procreation. Okay, do we I think we all agree that that the single biological imperative that binds every single organism on this planet is procreation.
Hmm.
It's the one thing that unites us in that similarity, right? uh, Organisms that feed better procreate better, organisms that are stronger procreate better. uh, I'm not able to imagine why would the experience of suffering then be different. And if it is different, yeah, sure, then if they actually experience suffering as a way of good, we are getting out of this karmic cycle and we are off this planet and I'm getting killed, great. But even for the little time that they are alive, I'm just not able to wrap my head around how
Yeah.
this hypothetical would play out at all.
I think then what you're appealing to is just this deep intuition. What you're saying is it's self-evident at this point.
No, I'm appealing to a deep similarity between all living organisms. Okay, the similarity, so I gave some examples which are obvious,
Hmm.
which I mean scientifically proved, right? It's a biological imperative for genes to propagate and so on and so forth. Uh, so there are very many similarities, and the idea that that me and my dog will experience suffering differently, therefore, I mean, for the person who sets up the hypothetical, the burden is on them to prove to give more evidence as to why a dog might experience some experience. Actually, I can think of some. Okay, a pat on my back, a pat on my butt, okay, might be insulting to me. It's not insulting to a horse.
Hmm.
Sure, that experience is felt differently. But as you can imagine, I have already pointed out one thing that can be different. But on the other hand, a gunshot will scare me and startle me the same way as it might startle a horse. Uh, and you can see that in the way they behave, in the way they respond. Uh, I think it's a bit of a straw man to examine that hypothetical. But what if they don't experience it the same way? I think we know what they don't experience the same way versus the things that they do experience the same way. A calf being taken away from the cow, a child being taken away from, a wheel being taken, a fawn being taken away from the deer. I think the same sense of alienation, abandonment that you and I might feel if we are separated from our parents might prevail there. It's much more likely. I'm not able to imagine how to play out this hypothetical. So that's one way of responding to it, that we take the hypothetical forward, and maybe if that experience is not as tormenting, yeah, then maybe the argument would change that, you know what, then suffering for them is different from suffering from us, and therefore it's okay. Maybe that hypothetical plays it out that way. Mm, on the other hand, we could not take the other way of responding to this, but there is a lot of scientific evidence which shows that actually animals and humans, evolved animals and humans, actually experience very many things in the same way. So for example, the most recent sort of surprising piece of evidence is the idea that prawns, shrimps, the whole
Yeah.
cephalopods families actually do not have a central nervous system, but they have very complex nervous systems, but they too socialize, they feel happiness, they are capable of having an inner life as our octopuses, for example. So as science progresses, I think we'll just uncover more and more inner lives of animals, and that hypothetical will become increasingly remote, that
Hmm.
they do not experience suffering in the same way that you and I do.
This question that I asked you is probably going to be the worst in the entire podcast because it is mine and not from another actually good thinker. And so I'll continue to sort of build on this. But I feel like this is a very abstract level conversation, right? I would urge listeners to go and look at what happens to animals in factory farms. So I remember when I was very young and I changed my mind about this idea. I did only because I watched what happens when milk is produced. The example of a calf being taken away from a cow is most pertinent here, but also how we treat animals in factory farms. Um, I think sometimes the argument that convinces us is not one that is filled with words, because you and I can talk for 2 hours, but sometimes that's rarely
Yeah.
what changes our minds. Okay, the next bit that I'm thinking about is uh, whether we do moral math. So, uh, given that we live in an actually messy world and we have, to make ultimate decisions, and decisions are always trade-offs between two or three different possible outcomes, um, we always have to pick some suffering, right? It seems likely to be in circumstances where sometimes you have to pick some suffering. And uh, is there a hierarchy here, that is, the more sentient something is, the more points it gets on this hierarchy scale? Or do we say that the capacity for sentience is enough, and that gives you exactly the same number of points as every other unique organism which has the capacity for sentience? And the example of this is the boat, right? So you have four humans, one dog on a boat.
Hmm.
The boat can only seat four people all of a sudden. Oh, sorry, four organisms all of a sudden, and
Hmm.
so one has to be thrown off board.
Hmm.
And almost everybody listening to this podcast, maybe even myself, would say throw the dog overboard. And this comes from a speciesist standpoint. But if not throw the dog overboard, how do we decide who to throw overboard? Is it fair to say it's going to be a coin toss, or a five-way tie, or each chops off a limb and we equally equally reduce
And
weight across the
all of
board?
us suffer
Yeah,
together for
all of
the
us suffer
rest of our
together.
lives. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, how do we do math when it comes to so many sentient organisms?
Yeah. This is the classic trolley problem equivalent. Okay. There is no right answer. Maybe there is, but I don't know it.
But the SI unit is, you think, equal, like one dog
No, it's
equal one
not. I've
human?
been
Okay.
saying it's a spectrum. I've been saying
No,
it
no,
from.
but in terms of, yeah, that is true. The
Yeah.
ability to feel sentience, or where you are on the sentience spectrum, is. But when it comes to points of moral consideration,
Yeah.
like, uh, then if it's not unequal, how many dogs before one human? You know?
So there I would actually flip it. I would say that what is your since we are talking about since we are talking about it in math terms, let me put it in math terms, okay? Which is that what is your potential for happiness left? Okay, so pushing the dog, the three humans on the boat, in my opinion, would inflict equal suffering because a dog is a sufficiently evolved organism to know to feel the same level of suffering which you and I would have felt if we were drowning. Then the question is, okay, who has life left enough to experience the joys of the world? My inclination then would be that you push out the oldest person,
Hmm.
because the rest of them actually have, the world is a beautiful place, there are very many happy experiences to be had, and we should then give more points to the person who will be able to make the fullest use of it. And this is a very utilitarian argument, which is uh, which is not what Peter Singer makes. Actually, Peter Singer says that, equal weightage being assigned to every
Yeah.
sentient being. And but it's easy to say that, but when you have to make a trade off, how would you make it? And my sense is that then you flip it, because if everybody is capable of equal suffering, and the same intensity of suffering, then you ask the question that who has the maximum potential to derive out of his or her life, because the world is a beautiful place and we must allow them to get the same advantage which the others have got. And yeah,
Yeah.
that's the way I would think about it.
Which is now a new step, because not only are you assigning a negative moral weight to suffering, but you are assigning a positive moral weight to happiness.
Happiness, absolutely.
Yeah. And
So sorry if I
yes,
did
go on.
not
Yeah.
clarify. I mean, maybe I should have clarified. Sentience is not just about suffering, right? Sentience is the ability to suffer, to feel happy, to feel hopeful, to have an inner life, to have a point of view, to aspire, to dream. So it's the whole gamut of positive and negative experiences that humans experience by the minute. I'm just saying that animals also have the capacity to do it, and many of them are able to do it as frequently as humans do. Maybe not with the same intensity, but they do it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Sorry.
But bringing sentience into the morality question,
Hmm.
You have said so far that we do have a moral obligation to prevent the inflicting of pain or suffering. But do we have a moral obligation to maximize happiness?
If we so I would say that yes, if we have to make a trade off
Okay.
and all other things being equal, then yes, then the consideration comes in that then who's how do I maximize happiness? And there, yes, I switch to a utilitarian view of the world.
But why when we don't have to make a trade off? Like right now, there could be an elephant somewhere that could be happier. Why don't we proactively reach out to the elephant and make the elephant happier? Like, I mean, do we have a moral obligation to do that? Is my question.
No, it applies only when there is a trade off, because here again it's a question of right. So here's the thing, okay? The thumb rule is that my moral obligation is not to inflict suffering, to minimize suffering, and by your own liberty framework that should allow the elephant to be as happy, to lead as happy a life as it can. Okay. uh, in fact, if I intervene and try to make its life happier, I may be intruding on its liberty, right?
Yes.
So but therefore, i- the default situation is moral obligation to mitigate suffering uh, to the extent possible. But when I do have to make a trade off, and those occasions arise more frequently than we think they do, in that case, if all other things being equal, how would you decide? And I think then you use this rubric of how do I maximize happiness?
And if the suffering is not inflicted but discovered, that is, you're walking down the
Hmm.
road and you see a dog who's clearly met with an accident and is limping or whatever,
Hmm.
is there a moral obligation to step in and minimize suffering that you did not inflict? Was inflicted by a rock falling on the dog, so
Hmm.
not even by an agent. A
Hmm.
non-moral agent has inflicted
Hmm.
this suffering. Uh,
Yes,
yeah.
totally. Yeah, I think so, because that involves mitigating suffering. Now, here there is the question of seen visible suffering and invisible suffering. Okay. And I don't know how to answer that question. If it's visible, like the example that you gave me, a dog run over and is limping, versus invisible, that a dog, I don't know, an elephant suffering in the jungles of Tanzania. Should I go out? I just read about it. Then do I have a moral obligation? um, I don't know. I suppose at that time, human constraints. I mean, we at the same time, we are humans, and there are limits to our physical and cognitive abilities. Do I have the moral obligation to donate to a fund that is dedicated towards that animal? Yeah, I mean, we can keep increasing the intensity of these hypothetical questions. But the thumb rule I would use to make these decisions would be minimize suffering, and when all other things being equal and you have to make a decision, maximize happiness. uh, Once you have that framework in place, the other decisions of how far should I go to act to minimize suffering is something that I think at some level it's an individual autonomy question. Where you want to be on the morality spectrum, we make that decision by the minute, right? So just to sort of stray a little bit from the subject at hand, but you and I, we are social individuals. We are by the minute pretending to be people who we may not be. I mean, we are manipulating, we are signaling, we are, do we have a moral obligation to be the most authentic versions of ourselves? Yes, I do. But where I choose to be on that morality spectrum is a question of autonomy. And if I extrapolate that to saving the dog who just happened to be on the road that I was traveling on, I would think that, I may choose to be that person who says that, look, I cannot unsee this and I have to do something about that dog and take him to the nearest vet, versus donating to a fund dedicated to a dying
Yeah.
animal in Tanzania. I may choose to be on a morality spectrum of saying that, look, this is a bit much and I'm not going to do it. That's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah.
This is a very famous thought experiment about you're walking by a lake when you see a child drowning, and
Hmm.
all you have to do is step into the lake and pull the child out. It's not like you're going to put yourself at harm or risk, but in the process, you're going to lose your shoes. You have this really nice new pair of shoes that you've bought,
Hmm.
maybe for like 10,000
Hmm.
rupees or something, really expensive pair. And in saving the child, you lose 10,000 rupees. Should you do it? And almost everybody will say, "What an insane question!
Yeah.
You obviously have to step into the water and save this child. Who cares about your shoes?"
Yeah.
But then when the question is pushed a little bit to, there are children in Africa who are dying right now,
Mm.
and as long as you're able to give mosquito nets to somebody in Maui who's able to then use the nets and not die of dengue and malaria, would you give 10,000 rupees to save an actual child in Africa? The answer would be most likely not. Most people don't do it. And
Mm.
there's something about just human intuition where if it's in my immediate surrounding, it's able to prick my
Yeah, tug at my
emotional. Yeah,
heartstrings
exactly.
much more.
And I don't know in in what degree people are using rational and reasoning methodologies to arrive at moral conclusions.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe it's even, this is the elephant in the brain, right? It's also possible that you're arriving at a conclusion first, and then your rational faculty is scrambling to
Mhm.
come up with an explanation of why you did it.
Yeah.
And so you're able to explain in this case, but in that case, since there's no decision being made before the rationalization, it never happens in the first place. Okay. I wanted to. I didn't include this in my notes, so if it's I'm also not well prepared because I didn't read up on the details. But as you were talking, it came up. It came to my mind. Is what's happening in Delhi with the stray dog situation, right?
Mm.
So the question
Mm.
is, what should our attitude be towards stray dogs? And maybe we can do it as a general case. And if you want to talk about specifically this case, I'm also happy to do that. But as a first question, should we be proactively neutering dogs? And is that something that we feel? Do you feel we have a moral obligation to prevent dogs from creating more puppies in urban spaces?
Yeah, so this is where the trade-offs question comes in, right? So, which is why I was saying that actually trade-offs are required to be made more often than we
Yeah,
might like to we believe. So here's the thing: there are competing interests here. It's obvious to everybody. The dog's ability to procreate, and the dog's liberty to live their best lives, and humans' ability to move around freely in an urban environment that they have created. I think let's start with the premise that the world and the planet is constantly changing. And it's humans have, of course, had a disproportionate influence in the way our cities, our spaces are built. Uh, that said, every organism actually changes the microenvironment in which it is functioning. I was, when we spoke, I gave you the example of beavers. Beavers have a natural, compulsive tendency to build dams wherever they are. Okay, cats have a natural tendency, a compulsive tendency to dig mud wherever they are. They are also changing their microenvironments, and this is the environment that we live in. So these trade offs have to be made. We cannot just, keep stonewalling the argument saying humans are at fault because actually we are the ones who build these massive cities and animals have no place to live and humans have been overfeeding the dogs. I mean, that argument will take us nowhere. So the question is, how do we get the maximum happiness, the utilitarian perspective, by balancing these trade-offs? And here I would say that yes, you basically neuter the dogs because it is impeding on human happiness, and at the same time you do not inhumanly treat the dogs, and you do not kill them. And so, in that way, maybe balancing those trade offs will allow us to maximize the happiness of the dogs because it is not suffering and it is getting to live the life that is left of it without really impeding on humans' happiness, of humans' ability to move around. And when I say that, I know the picture that often comes to mind are people who are basically animal haters, but actually all kinds of people, right? I mean, there are homeless people who sleep on the streets,
yeah,
whose children get affected by the dogs. There are old people who are not able to navigate the streets because of the sheer confusion of dogs. Sort of chasing them and things like that. So there are very genuine interests on both sides, and we've got to balance them. So morality, that's the thing with morality, right? It's not a 1-0. It's always a trade-off, and we've got to take, I mean, I would take the utilitarian view of things. And
yeah. I feel like the anybody who's anybody who hasn't thought too deeply about this, or who has thought deeply about it but has concluded the speciesist position, will just say the opposite, which is that no, not a single child should be at the risk of dying for any number of dogs. The moral, the utility math may so work out that this is more suffering net net. It means more animals are killed, or more dogs are rounded up and sort of taken care
mm,
of, whatever.
mm.
And by taken care of, I mean like terminated. But not a I'm glad that
Okay, I missed that in the first go. Okay.
yeah. But on the other side, we don't want children dying. It's just unacceptable. The whole purpose of rule of law is to prevent us, this particular set of people who are living here. We vote, we're the moral agents. Our interests come significantly above, like
Mm,
I mean, the multiplication math is infinite
mm,
before some other animal kicks into shape. And I'm feeling like the hardest thing to do is to break somebody out of that speciesist mindset, which is
Mm.
to say that you shouldn't care about your species, you should care about somebody beyond your species. And there are two competing forces. The first is just the evolutionary force, because forever you've
Mm.
cared about those closest to you. So, for example, you care about next of kin because you share blood, versus somebody who's part of another tribe because you don't share blood with them.
Mm.
And that's been a useful thing to have. The reason we've survived as a species for this long is because we've had this ingrained. Those who
Mm.
didn't have this ingrained and who were too lovey-dovey with animals ended up getting eaten by those animals, and so their genes never propagated. And those that did propagate
Mm.
are the ones that were extremely tribalistic and sort of held this sense that I'm going to keep my own safe, and my own are people who look like me and talk like me and look like me. And so you have to break out of that. And on the second side is you have rational arguments against animal ethics and utility positions, right? And so there are two camps of people who need to be
Mm.
convinced. The first
Mm.
of those who are naturally tribalistic,
Mm.
and the second of those who, even after thinking about the subject, conclude that the utility arguments are simply not correct. And so, isn't that like a lot for somebody who's,
It is,
yeah,
it is. There's no doubt about it. I think this is today the hardest conversation to have without getting angry, and without believing that actually the person is coming from a different point of view and is not truly divulging the intentions, or and very easy, especially in India, to be accused of caste biased or whatever the moment you start talking about vegetarianism. uh, but it is the battle that we've got to fight. I mean, if there's one thing that we truly believe in, but it's not okay, so let me take a step back. Today, we could have spoken about court data. Okay, I run a company which does litigation analytics using data from courts. We could have spoken about courts data, but what is there to disagree about? I mean, yes, we need the data. I mean, so when you came up saying that you organize a podcast, and which is essentially about positions that are not so easily decided one way or the other, I thought this was the one which
yeah,
which which we need to talk about more for sure. And I'm not saying that we should only come at it from an ethical perspective. I'm completely for having rational arguments, and I'm sure that there is a way to balance, assuming the rationalists have a point, right? There's a way to balance ethics with rational arguments, because what I have seen is that over the years, increasingly rational driven arguments are also supporting ethical uh, grounds, some way or the other. Somehow they always conclude that actually uh, it's in the interest of labor, for example, to uh, increase wages.
hmm,
Okay, and you meet both ends. You are able to take care of labor, you're able to take care of, and you're giving it a rational grounding for it. It's something like what you said a few minutes earlier, which is that often conclusions are arrived at, and then you have to scramble all your mental faculties to make sure that they fit within your larger worldview, so that it's consistent, so that you can personally reconcile with this idea that you arrived at surprisingly,
yeah.
and which wouldn't have otherwise fit in your larger ideology.
Yeah, upon self-reflection, this is me. I feel like I'm a person who first arrives at what it's. I have a very dear friend who, when I ask him why he believes what he believes, says, "I feel it in my bones," and
Yeah.
I think this is so true
Yeah.
of me as
Oh,
well, and true of
yeah.
most people,
A lot of
that you have
people.
an a priori that you feel in your bones, and then everything else is simply post-fact rationalization to try and justify why
Absolutely.
that's the case.
Many people would not admit it. Many people are not aware about it. And it's okay. I mean, that's the way we're wired. But as long as there's self-awareness, okay.
Yeah, and as long as we can change our minds, right? Which is why the
Mm.
whole podcast exists. Okay, so I want to do three more things because I have about 30 minutes left with you.
Okay.
The first is the question of natalism. So the anti-natalist position, if I was to articulate it, is in one of two camps. That phrase simply means that we should choose not to create more children, or rather that it is immoral to create more human children. Right? The anti-natalist position typically is about human children, although I'm trying to extend it now to animals. The first camp is the suffering-focused camp or the ethics-focused camp.
Mm.
So the ethics from suffering, right, or the utility arguments, where they are saying something like, it is not possible to have a life without suffering. You may be a well-meaning parent, you may do the very best that you can do for your child, whatever it is, but inevitably they will see disease and death and suffering and failure and heartbreak, and those are all things that will certainly happen to them, and those are all negative feelings. And for a mind that does not even exist, because before conception, before the child has even formed in the womb or whatever, before the act of sex even, that child does not exist. And if the child does not exist, what you can say for a fact, if you start with this framework, is that they certainly do not want negative experiences, right? For sure they don't want that. Second is happy experiences, right? Like the possibility of happy experiences. Again, because the mind does not exist, it does not mind that it does not have happy experiences, since there is no
Hmm.
mind to
Hmm.
exist in the
Hmm.
first place to have that
Hmm.
preference, right?
Hmm.
And so you end up with this asymmetry. The asymmetry is simply that what you know for sure is that you don't want to will a being into existence who can feel negative emotions or suffer, but also on the other side, you know for sure that it does not have a particular preference for happy emotions because it simply does not exist.
Hmm.
And given the asymmetry, you must conclude that creating new children is immoral, right? That's camp number one. And the other way to argue the antinatalist position, which I don't know if it fits into today's argument, but I like this argument more, is the argument from consent. That if
Yeah.
you believe in liberty, then you believe in the idea of consent. And if a child cannot consent into existence, then you simply shouldn't do it. It is immoral in the first place. Just like doing anything else to any living being without their consent is immoral. But that uses the liberty framework as the basis for morality. So if I were to do that first argument, um, then why not extend it to animals as well? Like to say that the problem is not really that once the animal is born, it suffers. The real problem is that the animal is being born at all. And if we want a world without suffering, we want a world without life. And so, for to those who are alive, let's proactively make the effort to make their lives happy. But let's also proactively prevent them from being able to create new life.
Okay, so I'll start with the anti-natalist position in the context of humans.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, and I haven't thought much about this. I don't have strong views on this, but since it links to suffering, and I keep saying that the thumb rule is that we must minimize suffering. To what extent does this apply to uh, giving birth or perpetuating your genes, right? And it seems to me that if our biological imperative is to perpetuate our genes, then it's not true for everybody that happiness will necessarily reduce if they actually give birth to to a child, because in fact for the parent, and if I were to just look at my obligation towards a living person who has to make the decision, for the parent it may well enhance their happiness, right? So what is my obligation to keep the decision maker happy versus my obligation to keep a future non-existent person happy, to prevent suffering on the current decision maker versus to prevent suffering on a future non-existent person, right? So I don't know how to think about the anti-natalist position without really giving due consideration to the suffering of the decision maker. Many people, in fact, I would say that the average person actually is very, very keen that their genes propagate, and this is their biological imperative, and this is what makes them happy. Am I then in any position to give to take a view on whether they should be mitigating suffering by not perpetuating their genes? I don't know. So to a person I mean, I'm just saying that I don't have any obligation to a person who's not existing yet. Once the person exists, so once it's conceived, then if I find out that the person exists, right? And you can say that the embryo exists at 3 months, or once it is conceived, we can take whatever view, whatever, wherever you are on the spectrum of consciousness of the embryo. Then yes, then I do owe an obligation to make sure that the embryo is either taken care of, or if the embryo is irreparably damaged and will lead a a vegetative life or a life full of suffering, then yes, I would think then I'm under an obligation to that embryo to mitigate that kind of suffering. But when it doesn't exist, I don't owe an obligation, is how I'm thinking about it.
But at the embryo level, the minute the embryo comes into existence, you now know that being will certainly have suffering. It may not be the suffering of a disability, or it may not be the suffering of some sort of mental deformment, but ultimately it will inevitably face
That's
suffering.
true. That's true. There is no existence without suffering. There is, in fact, no existence without violence. I mean, all consumption involves violence, all existence involves violence. But how many people can genuinely say on their deathbed that their net experience was just suffering? I don't know that. It is all too easy, and I'm sorry if I sound like a really old person, but it's all too easy to live today in an air conditioned room where for the first time in the longer arc of history we are able to control the temperature of our rooms, we are able to switch curtains up, and I mean we are able to do things without even typing, just at the we are able to think things and see them on our devices, it is all too easy to say that actually a life is, net suffering, but a life may well be net happiness. How do you know that? So it's not about just, discrete incidents of suffering that one must define as a life full of suffering, but I feel you've got to take the net. What is the net life? And I feel if you think that you are in a position to give a child a life which will be net happiness, I think the antinatalists, and again, like I'm saying, I haven't read much about it, but from the argument that you just described to me, it seems to me that the antinatalists are giving way too much importance to the suffering that might be their lived reality. I don't know, but it may well be that the child's experience would be completely different from theirs. I don't know that.
Yeah.
So before conception, I think no obligation to anybody who doesn't exist. After conception, you got to assess for yourself that is this an embryo that is likely to have a net happy life, and then
Yeah.
maybe that's what it is. Now, if we extrapolate to animals, right, because that is where we are
Yeah.
on animals, I think it's again, there are 2 points. It links back to our two earlier themes, which is that do animals have the agency to decide whether they want to give birth to new animals or not? And my sense is, even for the most sentient of the non-human species, I'm not so sure if they have the agency to decide that. In which case, their biological imperative takes over, and then are you making the animal suffer by artificially uh, uh, neutering, for example, dogs? We mentioned that, and that's why it was a trade-off that we took it. If you would have told me that these dogs are propagating themselves in forests, etc., I would have said, okay, I mean, why does it matter? But there we had a trade-off to make. Dogs living in urban environments,
Yeah.
and we have to take into account happiness of humans and non-humans, and therefore we took that we I arrived at that sort of, in my opinion, neutering is the more humane solution, which will enhance happiness for all. But otherwise, there's I don't see any sort of reason to impose an anti-natalist view to is that's what
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
called, right? Anti-natalist view to animals. Yeah.
Um, I hear you. The two things maybe that we can think of are, first, what is the morality of tossing a coin on behalf of somebody else? That is, it. If you have 10,000 lives, and even one of those lives is abject suffering, net net, is it better to have not had all those 10,000 lives at all? That is the antinatalist question. And the way they answer that question is by saying that if you take if you go back to a time when none of those 10,000 lives existed, right, then not bringing the other 9999 into being is not immoral, because you have no moral obligation to bring them into being. And so it's not immoral to have not brought them into being. They are not minds yet, and so they would not have a preference to have come into being. But that one life, the one out of 10,000 that did have, that would on its deathbed say, I would rather have never been born in the first place. Because some lives are like that. Some people are born sick, stay sick, and die very, very young. Many people may, on their deathbed or net, look back at their lives and say, look, I would have preferred never to have born in the first place. Willing that life into existence is absolutely immoral. And so, if that's why they force the math to take place before the life is born at all, like before the act of sex, before the act of conception. That's why they force it. And maybe the other way to argue that you should be doing math for those beings that don't even exist yet or not even suffering yet is to even think about cases like, for example, polluting. Right? Like I'm polluting the air, or I'm polluting a lake or river, and to some extent there is some suffering imposed on those alive today. But it's also possible to say that, look at how much, like now you're able to travel from point A to point B a lot faster because you have cars. There's industries who are able to have, capitalist goods being produced. There are so many good things coming out of this pollution that for everybody alive today, it's not net not really a problem. We could say that there's less suffering on the whole. However, the true consideration is for all the generations to come, those who have not yet been born, but who will certainly be born into a world where they will just have asthma, or die of an early heart attack or something like that. And so maybe we should incorporate those who are not even born yet into the moral calculus.
So on the latter, I want to say that generally on intergenerational equity, I'm not a big fan. I feel my obligation, if any, to minimize pollution is restricted to the people on Earth
Hmm.
today. I'm not a person who believes, because I don't see 1970s London, okay, or whatever, Industrial Revolution, the 20 decades, 20 years after Industrial Revolution, London was a horrible place. Manchester were horrible places to live in, and it would be hard to predict that standing in 1990s, actually they would be the best places to live in. We as humans are very very evolved, but our cognitive ability to be able to see the impact and consequences of our actions today on the future is actually very limited. So I think I would be doing a disservice to the future generations by not doing what's in the interest of today,
Hmm.
imagining some future suffering of tomorrow, because I don't know how that future will pan out. So that is why I'm not a big uh, endorser of intergenerational equity, because I feel our ability to see in the future is just very limited. There are very many variables that are playing, half of which are not even visible. And I just don't know how things will play out. On the former argument which you mentioned, that so just so that I get the argument right, you're saying that the the fact that that one life suffered, uh I
Yeah, so again, we'll do 10,000 lives. Only
mm,
one life is abject suffering.
yeah.
Now, if you go back to a time before those 10,000 lives were born, which, for example, you could do as today, 10,000 lives to come, right? So that we're standing today, but those 10,000 people have not been born yet. We, if you could say for sure that only one of them is going to suffer
Mm,
greatly, and today I make the decision not to breed any of them, none of them come to
mm,
life, right?
mm.
Nothing happens. It's not like I've caused suffering to anybody. I haven't done anything immoral. Nothing of the sort has taken place.
Yeah, but you're definitely inflicting suffering on one of them if you choose to breed
Exactly.
those 10,000 lives.
And because people are not aggregate numbers, each person is a person. To do something like that to one person, this is the, I don't know if you've read Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, but it's a story about how there's a city that survives completely on the suffering of exactly one child. Otherwise, it's a fully utopian city. But in a basement, in a secluded corner of the city,
Mm,
there is one child who lives in a small broom
mm,
closet like room
mm,
and is in perpetual suffering.
mm,
And there are people who go down. You're free to go down and look at the child if you want. And there are those who go down and peer through that little window and look at the child. And of those who go down, some of them choose to leave. They choose to leave Omelas. And it's a question about if you lived in a utopian society that did subsist on the suffering of exactly one child, even one child,
mm.
would you continue to partake in that utopia, or would you leave and say, I do not want utopia if it means this is the cost that we have to bear for it? And this is a deontological question. Do you, I mean, could also extend to something like we live in a society that is utopian, but based on the suffering of animals. That millions of animals have to suffer so that our plates are full, so that we do not starve
Mm,
or feel hunger.
mm,
And people like you look through the window and say, I can see what's happening to these children, and I choose to leave. Like, this is not the
mm,
city I want to live in anymore.
mm.
So, should we impose that suffering on this one person, knowing that they will suffer just so 9999 may not?
See, it's one thing to exit a situation that already exists. My worry with the anti-natalist argument, to the extent that I understand it, and I think these hypotheticals are great because they make it real, right?
Hmm.
Is that I'm not exiting it. I'm actually changing a possibility. Which has not yet panned out, and my ability to peer into the future is just really restricted. So I don't know. I've got to think about this.
Yeah.
Exiting 100%. Okay, I'm all for. I would be that one person who'd go down and totally exit a utopian city if it actually thrives on the suffering of one person. In reality, we all live on the suffering of
Yeah.
people who work in coal mines and so on and so forth, and there is a whole different sort of economics rationale to an incentive based rationale, which and liberty based rationale, frankly, to which I totally buy into. But the truth is they do suffer. I mean, by just the biggest stroke of luck, which is that you and I mean, by nature's lottery, you and I were born in places which allowed us to flourish and allowed us to live the lives that we are living, whereas they weren't. So that recognition is there. Have I walked out from that society? No, not yet. Can I walk out from it? Yeah, maybe at some point. But the point is that like that society, that situation has to exist for me. Okay, so
Yeah,
yeah,
I hear you. Okay.
future considerations of future, I don't know, because then um, I just can't imagine the future. Yeah.
Um, I want to now extrapolate this to pets, and then we'll do wild animals
Mm.
in the limited time that we have left. So, do you think that the breeding of pets is okay? I mean, in Bangalore, where we're currently recording this, so a little bit of a backstory. My co-founder, who I also live with, so we're also roommates, is just loves animals.
Mm.
If he wasn't doing this, he would
He,
instead, I think he'd be like a zoologist or something. Like he loves every type of other animal possible, not so much humans. And he told me very early on that he wanted to get a dog in the shared house that we live in. And I said that's not happening under any circumstance because I'm not going to walk it or poop it or pee it. And these are all free animals. I love dogs. They're very nice. But they got to be where they got to be and let them be free. I don't want like the entire dog's existence to revolve around my existence. And so this is like a minor point of difference, but I totally see where he's coming from. Until, of course, completely the way Providence works, a dog showed up outside our
Hmm.
doorstep.
Hmm. Are
So
you sure it was Providence and not implanting it?
no, no, 100% Providence
I'm
because
just I'm
she
kidding.
was
Yeah.
so sick. Like she was,
Okay.
when we found her, she was 8 years old and she had a skin infection. It was really in horrible shape.
Okay.
And of course, she continues to live in a house to date. She's the happiest dog in like a 10 square kilometer. He takes care of her like she's some princess or something. And she's the very best dog. Now, I'm very happy to have this dog in my life. I'm
Yeah.
sure she's very happy to have us in her life.
Yeah.
It's happiness all around.
Yeah.
But I can also see that the suffering that this dog went through for the couple of years before we found her, she was a breeder's dog before that, is clearly because of breeding. So these are animals that are caged and then made to make more pets. And the reason that these dogs have been created is so that you and I can buy pets as opposed to, I don't know, not have pets. Or and I can also think of a world where sometimes having a dog is useful in instances where you have to hunt or you want to herd your sheep, right? Those are all cases that we
Hmm.
originally domesticated dogs for,
Hmm.
versus these little tiny poodles that fit in your handbag
Hmm.
that can't hunt a rat even if their life depended on it and are clearly bred only for your joy and
Hmm.
satisfaction.
Hmm.
But it's also hard to grade one utility against the other. The utility of having a dog that can herd sheep versus the utility of a dog that can be my purse companion
Hmm.
have to be weighed against one another, and it's easy to say that neither of them is more or less important. So how do you feel about the whole pet ownership space as a concept?
Yeah, no. So I'll tell you what, I'll divide this question into two parts, okay? First is the easier part, which is pet ownership by itself. Okay, assuming so this dog, assuming let's say it wasn't artificially, it wasn't bred for the purpose of being sold
Yeah.
as a pet, okay? In that case, how do we feel about pet ownership and people adopting stray cats, stray dogs, whatever, okay? And here, I think there are two reasons why I'm actually quite comfortable with it. The first one being that actually, if you think about it, animals that have been domesticated by humans are have had the best chances of surviving on this planet. Okay, so at some point dogs were wolves. Now some breed of wolves had the sensibility to just hang around with
Yeah.
a pack of humans, and they had tremendous success, okay, in outliving all other packs of wolves. So if you just compare the number of dogs to the number of wolves alive today, and you'll see, I mean, it's just a stupendous success of wolves choosing to
Yeah.
get domesticated, okay? So there is a certain biological imperative of perpetuating your genes that works out for them if they choose to get domesticated by humans. It just works out that way. So I have no qualms with that kind of stuff. On artificial breeding, on breeding, sorry, just to sell, to be able to sell pets, yeah, I think that's problematic, especially if the breeder is inflicting greater suffering on the actually
Yeah.
on the born life. Suppose he or she doesn't find a buyer and abandons them, and that organism is not capable of surviving in the environment that exists today. Yeah, that's really problematic. uh, yeah, and this sort of conflicts with the whole, but the market works itself out and there's a price exchange and there's a double thank you moment and all that stuff. But here we're talking about philosophy. So and here I would say, just from an animal ethics perspective, no problem with pet ownership, as long, but yes, I would say breeding animals, capturing them, rearing them, keeping them in cages just so that they give birth to another animal, which in turn can be separated from the parent and given away to somebody,
Horrible.
is inflicting suffering.
Are they private property? Is a dog your private property?
uh, I think animals understand the concept of property. They understand what's theirs, especially when it comes to sharing food. They understand what's not theirs and things like that. So I don't know how they think of themselves as being property of others. When you say, are they property for humans, I mean, from whose perspective?
As in, uh, we refuse to allow the ownership of other human
Of
beings,
your other
right?
humans,
So I can't
correct.
own like
Hmm.
slaves, but I can own a dog.
Hmm.
And if the reason I can't own a slave is because they're a moral agent, then, and if we're extrapolating actually no, hold on. We're not saying that the reason we can't own a slave is because they're moral agents. We're saying the reason we can't own a slave, human slave, is because they are they are
They have
worthy.
interests,
Exactly, they have interests.
which
They're worthy of moral consideration
yeah,
owing to their
yeah.
interests. And if that logic translates to animals, then we should also translate this idea that okay, then we can't own the animal.
The question is, are you really taking away any interest from the dog by owning it? Okay. So if so here many people who are against pet ownership ethically argue that actually you are preventing it from living its natural life. And to that my argument is, but there is nothing like what is a dog's natural life, I
Okay, we
don't
can do
know.
fish then, right? Fish in an
Fish.
aquarium.
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping so but this applies to dogs and fish and cat and everything. Keeping organisms caged, in my opinion, it's the most tangible way of asserting ownership, and that is problematic. Ownership by itself, if it does not inflict suffering, I don't see a problem. So for example, the idea of private sanctuaries, private forests, privately developed forests, where you're breeding animals and you're letting them roam around, I'm okay with that concept, and that involves a sense of ownership,
Hmm.
but it does not inflict suffering. So, to answer your question in one sentence, if the sense of ownership is inflicting suffering on a sentient being, then I think it's problematic. Otherwise, per se, private ownership to me doesn't seem problematic.
Hmm. Even this idea that like when we say agency, we mean moral agency, but animals are definitely agents in that. Now this is a deep question about free will and that whole like do we ever get to be truly free? But
Hmm.
in whatever way humans have free will, in that way it seems like at least higher order animals do have free
Hmm.
will.
Hmm.
And like for example, this idiotic dog will show up at my door and she'll paw, and I have to open it. She'll come and jump on my lap and want
Hmm.
like a little bit of a belly rub or whatever, and then she'll
Hmm.
head out. And clearly, this is, I mean, of course, on in the most utility way of looking at this, she's just making sure her next meal is sorted, right? Like this entire evolved behavior is explicitly because those that didn't evolve this behavior were not as well fed, tended to
Hmm.
die out, and then those that did evolve this
Hmm.
behavior continuously got food, right? So I can acknowledge that.
Hmm.
But clearly, there's also this, whatever the word choice means, the choice to show up at my door and do a little bit of a
Hmm.
dance and then leave, and to
Hmm.
make me feel happy, and for me to make her feel happy, and for us to sort of say that yeah, we still have this bond ongoing, right? Like we haven't lost touch. And at a high level, it's what we do when we have conversations and trade on the stock market and do all these high level things. We're also doing the same thing. We're playing
Hmm.
a very complicated dance to ultimately ensure we have food on the table and we don't die out and there's replication of genes. And I think the complex question here is if they ultimately do behave like agents, that is, they go and do things by themselves of their own accord. How small can the cage be before it's a problem? Like, is a house a cage? For
Hmm.
pets today, the
Hmm.
house is the cage.
Hmm.
Is a barn a cage for lots of
I think this is really contextual. So if you keep a husky in
Hmm.
the size of this room, it's a cage. If you keep a husky in a private sanctuary of yours in I don't know, in the forests of Siberia, it's not. So the problem is not private ownership. I keep insisting, because private ownership can have tremendous benefits for the animal, both from its biological imperative perspective and for the life that it is living. It can reduce the possibility of suffering. It can mitigate a lot of pains, etc., that it would have had to go through otherwise in this environment. The problem is, if private ownership tantamounts to suffering, it's a problem. I'm pretty sure that if you had a husky, the exercise of its agency would be very different, so it would fall sick all the time, things like that. And you as a pet owner would be able to tell that this is not the right environment for me to sort of pet a husky, right? So I think it's a really contextual question. I want to emphasize, because we have less time, that I no problem with private ownership as long as it does not inflict suffering.
Yeah. So, finally, on wild animals. Okay. Now, I'm thinking that if we have the obligation to prevent suffering, and we have the ability at all times to maximize happiness for wild animals, how far should we go? This is the effective altruist sort of
Mm,
group of thinkers, where their thinking is something like most wild animals live fairly horrible lives. There's not even a single night that they fall asleep sure that they won't be attacked that night. Like we have the luxury of building walls around us and
mm,
a lock and a door and civilized society and a state and all that, and so we just like the joy we get from one night's sleep
mm,
is never mirrored. In fact, for most humans through most of history was never mirrored, and then for almost every animal alive today, it is unthinkable that they would sleep like that. And it's not just a matter of sleep; it's that you don't know when your next meal is. There's to be hungry and to be thirsty is the constant state of life, because you don't know if going to the lake means getting attacked.
Mm.
And even while drinking water at the lake, you are constantly looking out for somebody who's going to reach out and kill you. And even for apex predators like a tiger or a lion or whatever, they still have to struggle with the fact that they don't have their next meal, or there's
Mm.
going to be a drought or whatever, right? And it's perpetual suffering. Like
Mm.
life is basically perpetual suffering until you die. And because of this stupid gene replication that's been coded into all of us, they just keep replicating their genes because they do not think rationally about the world. And they're not in a position to, like us, improve their lives.
Mm.
They don't work in large groups, and they don't end up building cities and states and any of those things. And of course, humans prevent that. Like we actively prevent animals
Mm.
from being able to do anything that we would, I would think. And so, what do we do about wild animals? Like, do we just sort of say that here are our cities and there are your forests and you do what you will? Or do we acknowledge that there is so much misery in that forest and reach out and say that I have an obligation to reduce this?
Mm. Okay. Yeah, I had not thought about wild animals. So, what I'm thinking right now are my first thoughts. Okay. So, here's the thing, the assumption is that wild animals actually suffer all the time. And my sense of biological evolution is that actually evolution works to reduce the pain that is involved in getting your next meal, to escape your predators, uh, to be more alert and things like that. And my sense is that to the extent that biological evolution helps it, uh, it helps us as well as humans as well, right? That's the way it is. And that's, I mean, there are constraints of biology which we can't overcome even by however morally imperfect and however morally irreconcilable they may be with our position. So one is to say that biological evolution takes care of a lot of these things, and animals are fantastic evolutionary instincts, and they so there are animals that actually thrive in groups, in packs and groups, and there are animals that actually thrive in isolation. And I feel like there is some sort of a revealed preference going on where every species figures out for itself how it can best survive. um, if animals truly suffered all the time, it seems to me that, and assuming that there's some agency, okay, here, especially for the highly evolved ones, it seems to me that they would actually cut short their lives. So I don't know if you've seen these. Okay, again, these are videos, so maybe a lot of people will diss them, but animals in zoos, okay, they become listless, they lose interest, they do everything that will actually shorten their lives. And nobody, I don't know if many people have tried to ascertain their state of mind, but it seems to me that they have the agency to make those decisions. And maybe we would be seeing that kind of behavior in animals that are constantly suffering, animals that are sick, for example, too sick to hunt, etc. They just kind of, you know, they just fade away into nature and they stop fighting. But for the rest of them, it seems to me that it's not too bad. Like I keep saying, I haven't read much about wild animals, but uh, it is what biology already equips them with, and what human environment constrains them with. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how much of this is like the naturalistic fallacy of, like in the antinatalist literature, there's an example, it's a thought experiment about a woman who is kidnapped and taken to the 100th floor of a building. And I mean, unspeakable, horrible things are done to her every single day. But the window in the room is kept wide open. And the question that they ask is something like, how long before she jumps out? That is, how long before she acknowledges that the suffering being induced on her is. And the answer actually, the answer actually is something like, not on day one, right? It's actually some number of days, because,
Yeah.
for example, she can hope, and so her mind can come up with imaginative ways by which she will exit the situation, and
Hmm.
on some days cease to suffer.
Hmm.
And with every passing day, the suffering gets more and more normalized, right? So there are various biological tricks by which you are trained to just deal
Hmm.
with
To
your,
cope with
yeah,
it.
cope with your status
Yeah.
of suffering. And if you didn't have those tricks, you would have died out. And
Hmm.
so only those animals reproduced and replicated who imbibe these tricks, right? But ultimately they are still tricks, and ultimately what is happening is still immoral. And in the larger math, to prevent a life of basically suffering until death, to kill oneself earlier, is the right choice, because that means that I've
It's the
reduced my
rational
is the
choice. I
rational
don't know if it's
choice.
the right
No,
choice. Yeah.
by the calculus of suffering. Like you're saying
Hmm.
that more suffering is
Suffering is,
bad.
yeah.
Then just from a math standpoint, you would say, okay, cool. Then if I kill myself today, then it's zero suffering for the rest of my life. Versus,
No, so Deepak, then let me put it this way, right? If you're putting it in the calculus of suffering, the thumb rule, and I still ride with it, is that basically I must mitigate suffering. Should I burn all the forests and kill all the animals because they're constantly suffering?
yeah,
I think this question can lead us to ask us that question, which is that if animals are constantly suffering, why don't we kill them all? And I just feel that, but that necessarily assumes that you are actually living the best life that God can ever give you. Okay, we are also bound by constraints. We don't commit suicide on day two. So I mean, or we still want to live because we are hoping that days will get better and things like that. And maybe those are the states of mind that actually give you happiness and give a sentient being a more fulfillment. And maybe animals that are sentient actually also feel it the way we do. That the next meal will be easier, the next meal will be better, uh,
yeah,
whatever it is. So
hope.
one is your biological imperative of survival. uh, I think that is cause for happiness enough. And second is, yes, I mean, sentient beings are capable of figuring out ways to become resilient.
We've done 2 hours. I
Okay.
don't
Oh
think
my
that,
God.
yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think that obviously there's no answer to be found, but I'm so happy we did this,
Yeah.
because I have been thinking about this privately for the longest time, bugging all my friends about it.
Hmm.
And to have a guest on the podcast to do this has been an absolute pleasure.
It's been
Um,
my pleasure because I had given up reading up on this because it used to affect me a lot. But now that we've done this, I'm going to gather the courage to go back to reading
awesome.
on animal ethics.
Done. And I think maybe we should do like a follow on episode at some point once we've both
A
thought a
year
little bit
later, we
more. Yeah,
reevaluate.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Bhargavi, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Deepa, for having me.